afternoon, buonasera, welcome. We'll try to start with the second session on international large-scale assessments, on methods and results. This session in particular is really using data from one study, the International Civic and Citizenship Education Study, so we're going to approach this topic from different perspectives. And there's another dimension that it's unique to this session is that in each paper you will have also an illustration of methods for large-scale assessment data, but that will be coupled with like a substantive contribution to the field. We'll have 4 presentations, and each author will have a maximum of 20 minutes to talk about each papers, and after each of the papers we will have about 10 minutes of discussion, so we have plenty of time for that. We will start with a presentation from Diego Carrasco from the Catholic University of Chile, and I have to say that Diego will also deliver our second presentation, given that he is the co-author on a paper that is led by Natalia Lopez Ornical that could not join us today for very, very solid reasons. And after that we'll have other presentations which I will introduce at that time. So please, Diego, floor is
Okay, good afternoon to everyone. So the paper is addressing 2 methodological challenges, and this is already published, and you can consult the full chapter in this link. So it's in the below. The main topic that I'm going to talk about is classroom discussion, and so I'm going to tell you a bit about what is the kind of framework that we are using to understand the expected effects that varying levels of classroom political discussion had for students that are distributed across different classrooms. So the first idea is the what we call the sophistication hypothesis. This is the hypothesis that education has an effect on the organization of political knowledge on adults. The second idea that we use is the intergenerational transmission hypothesis, kindly introduced by Daniel to our research group. And here we are asserting that if there is a large gap between adults on political knowledge and there is no intermediate effect onto students, then we could guess the political knowledge of the students by their parents. So under these conditions, the main point is that classroom discussion is one of the few, let's call it compensatory factors of the schools that is giving something that a student from a more disadvantaged background wouldn't have at home. So if their parents don't have enough schooling years, there are most likely scenarios that they would have a gap regarding the rest of the adult parents on political knowledge and other practices related to political socialization. So the school is doing this, it's providing this process of political socialization for the students that wouldn't have that at home. That's the main idea why people study, or I think this is kind of like the main, let's say like main tradition why people study open classroom discussion. So this is the kind of items that we have for open classroom discussion. This is within the study of the IA, the International Citizenship and Civic Education Study. And what I want to point out is a specific feature that these kind of items have. If you look closely, and you wonder what is the referent of the item, that means what is being referred to, where is being inserted for each of the phrases that the student needs to say if this happens frequently or less frequently in their classroom when there are political discussion. All of the reference are at the group level. So the students is referring if the teachers in their classroom, when they are discussing political and social issues, if the teacher encourages students to make up their own mind. If teachers encourage students to discuss the issues with people having different opinions. And in other kind of items, is the students referring to their peers as a whole. Is the student bring up current political events for discussion in class. So these items are not referring to what a single student do, but what the classroom as a whole are doing. These kind of items have been identified in the literature, and they tend to be referred to them as reference shift items. So the main point is that for a collection of different items, you will have some of them in which the students can refer to an attribute that he has and that he can carry with him, like, are you a girl or are you a boy? Whereas when students are answering items that are of this kind, they cannot carry the attribute that they're answering to, because the attribute is not on themselves, it's on the school. If you have a study in which these items are there, and you have an appropriate sampling design, like the one that we have in this study, where when you collect the responses out of an intact classroom. So in the two-stage design, you have a probabilistic design of the schools from a full country, and then you have intact classrooms. Given that you have intact classroom, that means that you have all the students that are peers within the same classroom. So when they're answering these kind of items, they could be referred to a single teacher, and they could be referred to the same student group. If the school systematically mixes students up throughout the year, then you would have a different kind of interpretation out of these items. But let's say that, just for the sake of at least picturing one scenario, let's say that these are single students that are within the same classroom throughout the year. So if this is the case, then when we collect responses with these kind of items, we can build up a score that represents an attribute, not from the student, but for the group that he's in. And when we are using these kind of items, we have two main problems. One of them is that given that these items have this, let's call it rating nature, when this is often ignored, the most likely scenarios that researchers would use either a compositional model or a plain regression. So they would just take the responses out of the students at the student level, and they would use it to condition something else. For example, political knowledge. The second problem is related to the solution that I'm going to propose for the first problem, that it might be the case that even if the students are providing us answer to describe how a school practice is occurring in their school, they might have varying agreement. So there might be the case in which we have a school in which all the students agree regarding the frequency in which this school practice is occurring. And it could be the case that, as well, that we will have other schools in which that kind of agreement is lacking. So in spite of the how many times the teachers are encouraging students to have discussions between each other, following all these conditions, it might be the case that the students maybe are not sensible enough, they cannot recognize when this is happening, or whatever other reason that we might not know why it's happening. But the main point is that this could vary. And the present chapter, and in the presentation that I'm doing, we're going to try to address these two issues. Under a general umbrella, what I can tell you about these two problems, they have a direction. So if we ignore totally all of those, and the study that you're using presents certain features, you might be underestimating systematically the expected effect of this school classroom practice. So I'm going to show you first how results look like when we ignore the rating nature. So first, here we have the results for ICCS Italy. We're only going to use classroom discussion. I see a CSS from the students, and we're just going to partition the scores of classroom discussion. So we'll have the average the score for the school, and we're going to include it in this mixed model. So if we see the estimates, they are positive. So that means that if we pick a random student from a school, we will see that if they're under a high level of classroom discussion in their school, they will have higher returns in civic knowledge. But if we include now the responses out of the student at the same time in the second step, the effect washes away. It's not there anymore. The now is at the level of the student. If we account for differences between SES of the students, the direction of the estimate is going to be kept steady. It's more or less in the same way. So this is the issue. What we're getting in model 2 is not what we're looking for. This is a different estimate. So we are arguing here that when you're fitting multi-level models, you have a variety of different model specifications. And for these kind of measures, a few of them are more convenient for certain purposes. So if your purpose is to have a comparison regarding what is the relationship at the population level of the students and of the schools of an educational system, and you want to know the relationship or the varying levels of this school practice, you need a certain specific, a model specification, a certain model specification would be more convenient for that purpose in particular. So the compositional model is wrong, mainly because it's giving you the, what is there, the gamma C. I'm not to reach it. Yeah. You're just getting that estimate, which is that one. But the one that you the one that you actually like, or the one that I would recommend that you should be looking for is the red one, the gamma B. And the only difference between these two model specifications is just sometimes what is referred to as a reparametrization. So we're ordering the terms in a different way to get different estimates. And so if you follow me regarding the diagram that we're using here, so we need to picture the idea that we have a low level school attribute, like a high level attribute, and like the average school. And there would be a main trend regarding the between school relationships, and another estimate is giving you the information regarding what is the relative relationship between the student responses given they are in different clusters. And that estimate is a different one, which is gamma double Q, which is the one that is below. And if you sum the two, you would get then the between school level estimate. So if you have the compositional model, you can still get it, but you need to know in advance that this is the case. Our suspicions why this is happening is kind of common in the literature that is using these kind of measures, and there are like several examples of this measure in particular, is that the scores that you receive when you're a user for large-scale assessment, in most likely scenario, these are going to be generated by a latent trait model. That means that you have a response model in which the students are the main source of variance. So once you have a realization of the scores, you're just representing the propensity of the students to give you higher or lower responses, and nothing else. So the quickest way to address this issue is just to reparametrize the model using a different centering, and that's it. Or making the appropriate interpretation of the compositional model, in which you need to sum up these two coefficients and you will still get it. If you're only interested in the estimate. If you want to make interpretations out of variance components, that's a different issue. We're focusing only on the main trend of the relationship. So a little bit more complex solution that you could do, that is useful for what we want to do for problem 2, it's a different issue. So it's to use a different measurement model. So given that we have responses out of the students, we can use a response model in which we will have two sources of variance. One the students and the other the school. So now we can make interpretations in relative terms regarding the propensity of the students to give us higher responses that refer to the common practice in the school. There are in which the structure of how students are distributed across the population is informative to the model as well. One of the properties of that model is that it's going to give us two components. It's two scores. And those scores are already orthogonal, so we can fit them in the model to fix problem 1. So then the alternative model to address problem 1 would be just to retrieve those kind of scores and represent them in the model in some way. So the second problem is, it could be the case that the component here could vary systematically. So we will have higher dispersion or lower dispersion. And that means that the students agree more regarding the occurrence of or the frequency of the school practice, or they have less agreement regarding this school practice. So one way to display this is just to pick a few schools that they look to each other, and if they have more or less like a similar dispersion, and if the main effect is kind of like obvious, you can just like draw a line, and you would see what would be the main trend. But if there is higher dispersion, and this is heterogeneous between clusters, this is not so like clear cut. It's difficult to draw this kind of line. And then the question is, what can you do if you have varying levels of agreement? Because if you go into the organizational literature that works often with these kind of measures, they would tell you, look, you need to assure us that the group level measures are reliable enough. And if this is not the case, you shouldn't use them. So for the case of large-scale assessment, that would mean that we need to have a loss on sample. So some schools would fit the method, and a few other schools would not fit the method. We have done that exercise with the example that I'm going to show you next, and you can lose up to, let's say, 20% of the sample for the schools. The main issue with that recommendation that you should care for the levels of agreement at the cluster level is that it's not a rule of thumb that is applicable to all cases. The main issue with that kind of indexes is these are conditional to the inter-class correlation. So this is the separation between the clusters. So we might need something more specific to the situation that we are in. So what here proposing is to take into account the varying level of the dispersion of the students per cluster, and to include that in the model as a moderator. In that way, if there is a large variability, then we can penalize the schools that have lower agreements. And at the same time, we can still get the main effect of the school practice that we are interested in at average levels of disagreement of the students for a given country or educational system. So we just generally call it dispersion score model. This is not like a really new idea. This is already exists within the school climate research literature. It's usually called a school climate strength model. The main difference is that we're just reversing the score that we're using. So instead of having a higher agreement model, we're having a higher dispersion model. So the conceptual model look like this. So we will have socioeconomic status, we will have classroom discussion levels, political sophistication, which is civic knowledge, and the dispersion score that is going to moderate or alter the estimate of the school classroom practice. And the first result that I can comment is the interaction. This is negative. So it's penalizing the schools that have higher dispersion. And regarding the main effect of the classroom discussion, then at the last column, we will have the main effect of the school classroom practice at average dispersion or lack of agreement between students for this specific educational system. And we also can display then between those limits, then the school practice is rose to the amount of dispersion that we are observing to the school country, into the schools within the country, and there is a portion of the distribution in which is compromised. So instead of having like a single rule of thumb, we will have a specific area in which the estimates are rose to the dispersion. And there is another area in which they are not. So what I can tell you, I'm going to skip the substantial part. Because the main part across the three different studies, classroom discussion, it tends to be the case that works well. So once you control for it, and even if you do a wrong model, you will still get like the main trend that you're looking for. Classroom discussion is a positive factor to promote civic knowledge. But I would say that two things that are kind of like new is that this the risk of making a wrong conclusion, given that you're using a compositional model without knowing, it's present in at least 9 out of the 24 countries in 2016. So there are certain conditions for 9 countries in which if you ignore this nature, then you may lead to conclusions of the following term, like saying, well, classroom discussion is not that important for civic knowledge. This doesn't happen for other countries, but it happens for, let's say, I don't know, 9 out of 24. The other problem, the dispersion effect, is more, it's something that you would need to pay attention to, specifically to 6 countries. If you ignore this effect for the rest of them, like you wouldn't notice, because your estimates are not going to change that much, even if you do the full-fledged model that we're proposing, but for 6 of them, it's more critical. And what we see with the estimate when we compare them is that once you introduce the dispersion effect correction, you get a higher estimate for the main effect of the school practice. The main message that we are trying to convey with this chapter is to say that, look, this is not the only measure that exists out there that has these features. There are many measures now within different rounds of large-scale assessment that are using these kind of items. So these methods might be applicable to not only to ICCS and not only to open classroom discussion. They might be applicable for sure for ERSA study. There might be applicable with maybe a few more reflections with PISA studies and also with teams and jobs. And with at least 2 methods, you can make a diagnosis like how important this is for the kind of methods that you want to deliver.
Okay.